Storm Blown by Nick Courage. Part 1. Hatching. San Juan, Puerto Rico, June 10th, 11 a.m. Alejandro, the old man shouted, his voice small in the rising wind. Las sillas, the chairs, they're blowing away. A turquoise lounger slid across the slick deck of the San Juan Palastro Resort and Casino, its waterproof fabric stretched and filled like the sails of a ship. Alejandro ran after it, his skinny shoulders squared against the wind and rain as his padrino squinted at the approaching storm. Most of the guests had already evacuated, cutting their vacation short as weather advisories rolled in with the clouds. The few who had hoped for the best and ignored the warnings were holed up in their rooms enjoying complimentary cocktails and wondering if it was too late to leave. It was too late. Just minutes before, Alejo and his mother's uncle, Padrino Nando, had joined the hotel staff in the lobby for an emergency meeting. They stood near the doors with their other groundskeepers, not wanting to track mud onto the marble floors, as the manager informed them that the bad weather that they had been having all week had been upgraded to a tropical storm. Tropical Storm Valerie. Nando had laughed and clapped his hands. It was a name like one of their tourists, another Hawaiian-shirted guest with no real love for the island. But Valerie was nothing to laugh about. All flights out of Alverde were grounded until the storm blew over, and most of the birds were already gone. The loons, the geese, the herons, even the gulls, they were smart like that. Except for a handful of purple-black cormorants that were fighting the wind for fun, the swirling gray skies were empty. Padrino Nando smiled as Alejandro dragged the runway lounger back to the others, tying them all down with a bright nylon rope. Somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, not so very far from shore, winds were gusting over 40 miles per hour. Faster than traffic, their manager had said. Sometime that night or the following morning, those winds and the rain would hit the streets and they would flood and end the tourist season early. Or everything would be fine. It all depended on how angry the white peaks were out in the surf. Alejo! Nando shouted. Look! The palm trees lining the Palastro's white sand beach bent toward the resort, their leafy crowns catching the wind. Beyond them, the cormorants took turns dive-bombing the rolling waves. With the sky so gray, and the sea so gray, and the rain running down their faces, it was hard to tell what was earth and what was air. Nando squeezed Alejo's shoulder with one wrinkled hand as they watched the cormorants fish, shading his eyes with the other to better see their long necks piercing the surf like arrows from the heaven. No matter what happened, the storm would be gone in a few days, spinning up to Bermuda or threading its way into the Gulf of Mexico toward the oil rigs and refineries off the muddy coast of Louisiana and Texas. Padrino Nando didn't care where the storm went, only that the cormorants were full and happy. As long as there were birds in the waves, San Juan would be fine. New Orleans, June 10th, 2 p.m. By the time Sam Gridley developed a taste for frog soup, Emily had finally settled into her book. It hadn't been easy. Sam's story was written so long ago that Emily was borrowing her mom's childhood copy of My Side of the Mountain. They both had it assigned for summer reading, 20 years apart, and the pages were brittle and yellow. Emily traced her finger over an ancient crease, her vision blurring at the edges as she folded and unfolded the same corner her mother had dog-eared when she was a kid. She tried not to think about Elliot and the surgery and her dad working on the oil rig while her mom worried herself sick, but it was all too much. She couldn't concentrate. The words just wouldn't stick in her head. It didn't help that her apartment was so small. Between the low groan of Elliot's humidifier and the cable news blasting from the living room, she'd had to stop 3 times and start from the beginning. The thought of starting all over again was too much for Emily to bear, so she chewed her lip and turned the page. Sam, the main character, had run away from home and was camping in the hollowed out tree, but Emily had to admit that he was doing okay for himself. Maybe even better than she was. Emily had been living on fast food for the past month, and her mouth watered as she reread the recipe for Sam's favorite meal: acorn flour, water lily buds, and wild onions served in a polished turtle shell bowl. If you left out the frog legs, it'd be perfect. But even without them, there was no way she could get any of that stuff at their grocery store. The Winn-Dixie that they went to on Saturday mornings had flickering fluorescent lights and a security guard who was always sipping from a quart of pink flavored milk. It wasn't a farmer's market, that's for sure. Emily's mom cursed at the news while Emily daydreamed about hand-picked mussels sizzling over open fire and the crunch of fresh green vegetables. Soon they'd start shopping at the fancy stores again, the ones they'd gone to before Elliot got sick, the ones where happy people got their groceries. Those stores had everything. For the 4th time that morning, Emily closed her book, holding her place with a finger. It was too hard to stay focused while she was blinking back tears. "I'm fine," she whispered. But the tremble in her voice gave her away. Even though everyone said Elliot was going to be fine, Emily felt sad, and the apartment was dark and cold, which made her sadness feel more real. For the past week, the curtains had been pulled tight to keep out the dust. For Elliot. Before he came home from the hospital, Emily and her mother had scrubbed the apartment on their hands and knees until everything smelled like lemon and bleach. And then the real cleaners had come, another mother and daughter team. They'd turned the radio up so loud it drowned out the television, and they'd sung along to songs Emily recognized from the aisles at the grocery store. It had felt good to have them in the apartment, laughing and singing in the warm late afternoon light. It felt like a new start. Emily's mom had smiled then, and Emily had smiled too. Before the cleaners, the entire summer had felt wrong. As soon as school had let out, most of Emily's friends had gone straight into summer camp. The others had left on the long roads to ramshackle cabins and rented beach houses in Pensacola, like her friend Katie. One girl was going to Mexico to see the pyramids. Emily knew because they had all had to write essays about their summer plans and read them out loud to the class. Emily had written about her visiting her Aunt Lillian in Florida. She was proud of her essay. Aunt Lillian had promised to take her to a clear water swimming hole where you had to keep an eye out for alligators. Everyone thought that was a lie, but it wasn't. Except that she never got to go to Florida after all. Emily frowned. So far, she had spent most of her summer curled up on 2 hard plastic chairs in a hospital waiting room, listening to her mom whisper shout at the insurance companies, Aunt Lillian, Emily's dad, and whoever else Emily's mom could get on the phone. Emily's friends texted her inside jokes and photos of themselves buried in the sand. Emily always responded, but her heart wasn't in it. Most of them didn't know about Elliot, and she didn't know how to tell them. While Emily's mom watched the never-ending news in their dark and disinfected apartment, Emily listened to children playing in their shared backyard. The world was full of people who didn't know what they were going through. Normal people. Her tears were slow and hot, and she bravely sniffed them back as her book slipped loudly on the floor. "Emily!" her mom shouted from the living room. Emily waited for footsteps, but none came. Her mother was planted firmly on the couch, watching the weekend weather forecast. As usual, Emily closed her eyes and pictured her staring moon-faced at the glowing blue screen. Em, are you okay? I'm fine, Emily shouted, forcing herself to smile so she might actually sound fine. She rubbed the tears from her eyes with the back of her hand and kept the smile plastered to her face. There was no way they could have known that everything would be even harder when Elliot came home. He had always been thin, but he was so much thinner when he was released from the hospital. His dirty blonde hair looked brown and his lips were cracked. The nurses had joked that he got a little dinged up in the shop, and Emily's mom had laughed gratefully, like it was the funniest thing she had ever heard. But when they got Elliot back into his bedroom, she was so scared he would get sick again that Emily wasn't even allowed to see him, even though her hands still smelled like lemons. Even though Elliot had been her best friend since the day she was born. Emily picked her mother's book up from the floor, smoothing the pages where they were crumpled. I'm going outside, she said to no one in particular. She slipped her phone into her pocket and walked to Elliot's room. The doorknob felt cold in her hand, refreshing. She half turned it and then stopped. If there had been a sliver of light, she would have gone in. But the crack beneath the door was dark, as usual, and there wasn't any point in getting their mom worked up. The floorboards creaked as she tiptoed away, so loudly that she almost didn't hear her brother calling her name from the shadows.